The gate is still there. You won't find it on a map. No archaeologist has ever dug it up. But it's there, in the story, standing at the edge of a garden that used to have two people living in it and nothing between them and God but open air. Now there's a gate. And a guard made of fire, turning every direction, so that no one gets back in. We'll come back to that gate. Here's the thing almost nobody tells you about the Bible: it isn't 66 books. Not really. It looks like 66 books, because that's how it's printed, stacked in a row like a shelf of unrelated titles: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, on and on, all the way to a strange one at the end about dragons and thrones and a sea of glass. You've probably owned one for years and never read it in order. Most people haven't. Most people open to a random page, read a verse, close it again, and walk away with pieces of a puzzle they never saw assembled. This is not a rulebook. This is not a religious encyclopedia. This is not 66 separate opinions written by 66 separate men who never spoke to each other. This is one story. One plot. Written across roughly 1500 years, by shepherds and kings and doctors and fishermen and at least one tax collector, and every single one of them, without knowing it, was adding a sentence to the same paragraph. And the whole plot, the whole reason any of these books exist, starts with that gate. Somebody gets locked out of their home. And the rest of the book, all 66 of them, is the story of somebody trying to get them back in. You're going to watch that story unfold in 4 acts. First, the law, 5 books that read like rules but are actually a doorway being built. Then history and wisdom, the story of a promise made to one family, tested for 1,000 years. Then the prophets, men who saw a rescue coming centuries before it arrived and wrote it down anyway. And finally, the Gospels, the letters, and one last vision from an old man alone on an island, the door swinging open. Stay with me. Because by the end of this, you're not just going to know what each book is about. You're going to see the shape of the whole thing at once. Maybe for the first time in your life. Let's start where the story starts. With a garden. And a gate that was never supposed to be locked. Genesis opens with one Hebrew word doing almost all the heavy lifting. Bara. Created. In the Old Testament, it's a word only ever used for what God does, never for what a human builds, or shapes, or assembles out of something else. A carpenter doesn't bara a table. A potter doesn't bara a bowl. They're working with material that already exists. Bara means calling something into being that wasn't there a moment before. Which means the very first word of the very first verse is already telling you what kind of story this is. Not a myth about gods fighting over leftover matter. A God who speaks, and there is something where there was nothing. You'd think a story that starts that big would stay in the sky. It doesn't. Within 3 chapters, it's about a man and a woman, a tree, a choice, and a gate closing behind them. Genesis is the book of the home that gets lost. Adam and Eve, then their children, then entire generations, drifting further from the garden with every chapter, until you get to one man, old enough to be forgotten, who God asks to leave everything he knows and go looking for a home he hasn't seen yet. His name is Abraham. He never finds it. He dies in a tent, still waiting. But before he does, God makes him a promise: your family will become a nation, and through that nation, everyone else locked out of every other garden will find a way back in too. That promise sits there, unfinished, for 400 years. And then it gets picked up by a man who, on paper, has no business carrying it. His name is Moses. He's raised in Pharaoh's own palace, close enough to a crown to almost touch it, and then, at 40 years old, he kills a man in a moment of rage and runs. Not for a season. For 40 years. He becomes a shepherd in the middle of nowhere, tending someone else's sheep, the kind of man history simply forgets. And that's exactly where God finds him. Not in the palace. In the wilderness, at the far end of a life you'd assume was already over, in front of a bush that's burning and somehow never burning up. You can imagine what that must have felt like. You're 80 years old. You've spent 4 decades convincing yourself your best years are behind you. And then flames start climbing a bush that isn't turning to ash, and out of the fire comes a voice that knows your name. God tells him to go back. Back to Egypt. Back to Pharaoh. Back to the very kind of power that would kill him on sight if it remembered who he was. Moses asks God who he should say sent him. And God answers with 4 words that Jewish scholars have spent 3,000 years trying to fully unpack: I am who I am. Not a name you can carve into a temple wall and control. Not a God you can bargain with. A name that means, roughly, I simply am, the one thing everything else depends on to exist at all. Here's what most people miss about the next 5 books. Genesis through Deuteronomy get lumped together and called the law, and that word makes you imagine a stack of rules, a legal code, something dry and administrative. It's not that. It's a doorway being built, one board at a time. Exodus is the home promised, a people walking out of slavery toward a mountain where God says, in essence, come live close to me. Leviticus is the instructions for what happens when you actually try to do that, because when you put a holy God in the middle of an ordinary camp full of ordinary, faulty people, you need a plan for how that works without everyone getting burned. Numbers is the cost of not trusting the plan, an entire generation that saw the miracles firsthand and still couldn't believe the door was really open, wandering in circles until they ran out of years. And Deuteronomy is Moses, old now, standing at the edge of a land he will never enter himself, restating the whole promise one more time before he lets someone else carry it through the door. There's a woman worth mentioning here, even though her book comes later. Her name is Ruth, and she's not even Jewish, she's a widow from a nation Israel wasn't supposed to associate with, who chooses loyalty to her mother-in-law over the safety of going home to her own people. Where you go, I will go, she says, and that choice, that single act of heed, of loyal love that shows up when it isn't owed, writes an outsider directly into the bloodline of the story's future king. Which tells you something important early on. This story was never going to be about one bloodline keeping the promise to itself. But it gets stranger. Because the promise is about to be handed to a king, and the king it gets handed to is nowhere close to perfect. That's 5 books down. 61 to go. And already you can see the shape of it, a home lost, a promise made, a door being built board by board. If that's landing for you, hit subscribe, because we're about to watch that promise get handed to a shepherd boy who has no idea what he's walking into. Let's keep going. David is the youngest of 8 brothers, small enough that when the prophet Samuel comes looking for Israel's next king, nobody even calls him in from the field. He's out with the sheep. An afterthought. And he's the one God picks. You know some of what comes next: the giant, the sling, the years on the run from a king who wants him dead. What gets skipped over is what happens after David actually gets the throne. God makes him an enormous promise: your house, your kingdom, will be established forever. And David, who fought giants without flinching, responds to that promise the way you'd expect somebody to respond to news too big to hold. He sits down. The text says he sits in front of God and basically asks, "Who am I that you'd say something like this to me?" Then he ruins almost everything. He sees a woman named Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop below his own, sends for her while her husband is away at war, and when she becomes pregnant, arranges for that husband to be killed in battle to cover it up. Quietly. Efficiently. The way you cover up something you've already decided you're not going to stop doing. A king. A murderer. The man the eternal throne was promised to. Hold that thought, because it doesn't get erased from the record. It gets left in detail, right next to the promise, because the point was never that David deserved the throne. The point was that the promise didn't depend on him deserving it. If it had, the story would have ended right there, on that rooftop, and never gone anywhere at all. Out of that failure, and the grief that came after it, David writes some of the rawest lines in the entire Bible. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. That word again, heased, loyal love that keeps showing up when it isn't owed. The wisdom books that follow, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, aren't abstract philosophy. They're what it sounds like when real people try to keep believing a promise while living through ordinary, painful lives. Job loses everything and demands an answer. Ecclesiastes tries every possible source of meaning and calls most of it smoke. Proverbs hands down hard-won wisdom from a father to a son. None of it is theoretical. All of it is lived, which is probably why you can still read it and feel like it was written about your week, not somebody else's, 3,000 years ago. And this is where it gets remarkable, because that promise to David, a king, a throne, forever, doesn't die with him. It gets picked up centuries later by men who watch their entire nation start to fall apart and somehow keep writing about a light on the other side of it. One of them is a court prophet in Jerusalem named Isaiah. He's not shouting from the wilderness, he has access to kings, a front-row seat to power. And from that front-row seat, he watches the whole thing start to collapse, foreign armies closing in, alliances failing, the kind of slow-motion disaster you can see coming for decades and still can't stop. Most people, watching their world end like that, would write about the end. Isaiah writes about a servant. He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities, written roughly 700 years before a single Roman soldier ever raised a hammer over a nail. Historians have argued about a lot in the Bible, but the age of that scroll isn't really one of them. Among the scrolls found at Qumran, near the Dead Sea, is a nearly complete copy of Isaiah dated to well over 100 years before Jesus was even born, physical proof, sitting in a museum today, that this wasn't written after the fact to fit the story. It was there first, waiting, exactly the way you'd wait for someone you already knew was coming. This is not fortune-telling. This is not vague poetry that could mean anything if you squint. This is a rescue being announced centuries before it happened. The other prophets carry the same note in different keys. Jeremiah watches Jerusalem burn and still writes that God will one day make a new covenant, one written on the heart instead of on stone. Ezekiel, exiled in Babylon, sees a valley of dry bones stand up and breathe again. The 12 minor prophets each hammer the same point from a different angle: the door isn't closed. It's just not open yet. Pay attention to this, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. Every one of these men is writing from exile, from collapse, from the losing side. And not one of them writes like it's over. Now watch what happens next, because the man who becomes the loudest voice for this rescue starts out trying to destroy it. His name is Saul, and he's not a bystander to the early Christian movement, he's hunting it. Dragging believers out of their homes, holding coats while a man named Stephen is stoned to death, traveling from city to city with letters of authority to arrest anyone caught following this new movement. He is, by every account, the last person you'd expect God to use. And then, on a road to Damascus, in the middle of doing exactly that, a light stops him in his tracks and a voice asks him a single question: "Why are you persecuting me?" He's blind for 3 days after that. And when his sight comes back, so does everything else. His name changes to Paul, and the man who once hunted Christians spends the rest of his life becoming one of the most relentless voices the movement has ever had. He preaches in marketplaces while soldiers watch from doorways. He preaches in a dye shop to a woman named Lydia, who ends up risking her own safety to help him. He writes some of his most important letters from inside prison cells, chains still on his wrists, running out of paper and light, and if you've ever tried to write something that mattered while everything around you was falling apart, you already understand more about Paul's letters than most commentaries will tell you. Those letters, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, and a dozen more, aren't abstract theology written in an office. They're urgent mail sent to real, struggling churches, and they all circle back to one Greek word, euangelion. Gospel. Good news. Long before it meant anything religious, it was the word used in the ancient world for the announcement that a battle had already been won, a runner arriving breathless at the city gate with news the war was over. That's the word Paul chooses, over and over, for what he's telling people. Not advice. Not a new set of rules. An announcement that something has already been decided. Here's the part nobody tells you: almost a third of the New Testament was written by a man who spent years of his ministry in chains. And it's not just Paul who ends up writing from somewhere he never wanted to be. There's one more voice left, and it belongs to the last disciple standing. His name is John, the one the Gospels describe as the disciple Jesus loved, the youngest of the 12, the last of that original group still alive by the time he's an old man. By then, the movement has scattered across the Roman world, being hunted the way Paul once did the hunting, and John himself has been exiled, alone, elderly, cut off from everyone he's ever pastored, to a small, rocky island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos. And it's there, alone, with nothing but the sound of the sea and whatever's left of his own memory, that he sees it. A vision so overwhelming he falls on his face like a dead man. The Greek word for what happens to him is apocalypsis, which you've probably heard and assumed means catastrophe, the end of everything. It doesn't. It means unveiling. A curtain being pulled back. Not a code for you to crack. A window suddenly open on something that was true the entire time. And through that window, John sees the gate. The same gate from the very beginning of this story, guarded, locked, closed off since a garden lost thousands of years earlier, and in his vision, it's standing open. There's a tree in the middle of a city now instead of a garden, and it's called the tree of life, the same tree humanity was cut off from in Genesis chapter 3, and this time nothing is guarding it. Let the one who is thirsty come, the vision says. Come and drink. The door that closed on the very first pages of this story is standing wide open on the very last ones. Think about a parent whose child has run off somewhere they shouldn't be, the kind of night where you check your phone every few minutes, leave the porch light on, refuse to lock the front door no matter how late it gets, because the one thing you will not do is make it harder for them to come home if they change their mind. That's the picture underneath all 66 of these books. Not humanity slowly finding its way back to God through good behavior and religious effort. God, refusing for 1500 years of writing to lock the door. The gate was never the problem. It was never really locked from his side. So here's the whole shape of it, laid out in one breath. 66 books. 1500 years. Dozens of writers who never met each other. And one plot running underneath every single page, a home lost in a garden, a promise made to a wandering man, a door built board by board through a law you were never meant to just obey but to live inside of, a throne handed to a king who didn't deserve it, a rescue announced centuries early by men watching their whole world collapse, and a gate, the same gate from the first 3 chapters, standing open in the very last 3. 3 things worth carrying with you. First, the Bible was never 66 disconnected books. It's one story in 4 acts, law, history and wisdom, prophets, and gospel, and now that you can see the spine of it, you'll never read any single book the same way again. Second, you are not reading this story from the outside. Ruth wasn't supposed to be in the bloodline, and she ended up in the bloodline. The letters weren't written to strangers, they were written to real, struggling people trying to hold on to a promise in the middle of ordinary, difficult lives. If Ruth gets written in, and a broken king gets written in, and a man who once hunted the church gets written in, there's a place in this story for you too. And third, the one worth sitting with the longest, for 1500 years, across every collapse and every failure and every generation that wandered further from the garden, God never once locked the door from his side. The porch light stayed on the entire time. That was always the plot. Out of every book in this list, which one surprised you the most? Which what it's really about changed how you'll read it next time? Tell me below. I read every comment. The gate is still there. This time, it's open. And it always was.